Thanks, Tom, for giving me the opportunity to talk about what is a remarkable success, because too often I think when we consider cancer, we think about the people in our lives that are either suffering, undergoing chemotherapy, or have passed away. And certainly in my life in the last 2 or 3 years, especially somebody many of you who will know, Don Metcalf, who worked at the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute for 60 years and passed away from pancreatic cancer in December 2014. We think about the failures, and as scientists, what drives us often is the failures. So I think it's a nice opportunity to be able to talk about a success. And it's a success that is 30 years in the making. A discovery made in 1989 about how cancer cells hijack normal machinery and, in a sense, extend their use-by date. So rather than dying in a few days or a few weeks or a few months, survive for years and accumulate. That's the basic research story. The translational research story is very much a story of ACRF in partnership with researchers. When I talk about ACRF, I'm really talking about two groups. The remarkable board and staff of ACRF that I think inspire us all, but the supporters within the community that underpin everything. And the success has been centred around the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute has received, I think, perhaps now 5 grants, but there were 2 that were pivotal to our ability to move from basic science to translating into something that was going to benefit the community. And that was a grant in 2001 that funded a remarkable structural biologist named Peter Coleman and allowed him to move from an institute that was shutting down in CSIRO to the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute. Structural biology allows you to work out atom by atom the shapes of proteins. And among those proteins that we work on are proteins that get hijacked by cancer cells and are therefore targets for the development of new pharmaceuticals. The second, I think, landmark grant was around the establishment of a division of chemical biology, which is really the flip side of the same coin as structural biology. If we now know the detail of the structure of the proteins, with chemical biology we can design the new pharmaceuticals that fit and target that protein precisely so that when a patient gets that therapy, they don't have to put up with the horrible side effects of chemotherapy, which can often be almost as debilitating as the cancer itself. So this year we celebrated a landmark, and that was that the Food and Drug Administration in the United States approved for human sale a drug called Venetoclax that's now used to treat chronic lymphocytic leukaemia. They were clinical trials that were done in Australia in collaboration between the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute and the Peter MacCallum and the Royal Melbourne Hospital. So Australian patients benefiting from those test pharmaceuticals first. And I think one of the most touching things that I've seen in the last 20 years as a researcher, and certainly the last 7.5 years as director of the Walter and Eliza Hall, was the press conference where there were 2 men much the same age as some of the gentlemen in the audience, in their late 60s, early 70s, who were part of the phase 1 clinical trial. And they received Venetoclax at a point where they were given a few weeks or months to live. And 4 years down the track, they were still alive. And that's good. But it's what they did in those 4 years which I found remarkably touching. One had walked his daughter down the aisle, and the other had seen the birth of his first grandchild. And when we think about why we try to turn cancer into a killer disease, from a killer disease into a chronic disease where perhaps you die of something else 5, 10, 15, 20 years later, it's not just life for life's sake, it's life for those landmarks. And for scientists, there could be nothing better than being part of those landmarks. And what I want to say to everybody here is that those sorts of things don't happen unless there's a wonderful relationship between the research community and the general community that are donors and supporters to wonderful organisations like the ACRF. It's not just the funds that allow amazing research to be done. Science is a roller coaster ride. To go for 30 years on a project means there are some ups, but there are a lot more downs. Downs where your experiments don't work for the days, months, sometimes years. And what gets my researchers through, whether they're researchers that have been in the game for 60 years like Don Metcalf was, or whether they're researchers like David Vaux was in 1987 when he made the landmark discovery that led to Venetoclax. He'd been in the game just a few months. What gets us through is knowing that there are people in the community that value what we do. And so the money is fantastic, but the moral support is everything. It makes the dark days where experiments don't work seem that they can be overcome, that there's light at the end of the tunnel. So I want to thank you on behalf of all of the researchers in Australia for your generosity, for your foresight, for your passion, and I'd encourage you to continue to support the ACRF in its mission to make cancer something that we can live with as a chronic disease, or in Ian's case, prevent entirely. So thank you so much, thank you for your passion, and thank you for your support.
Wonderful stuff. Let me ask you a couple of quick questions. You tell the great story of those two men, but from what I understand, the trials more generally, the numbers you were getting back are pretty encouraging, yeah? Can you put some numbers on what seemed like to be the initial success rates of Venetoclax?
So Venetoclax was has initially been approved for chronic lymphocytic leukaemia of a type that really gave people, as I said, a few months at best. So the latest studies look like that 40% of patients go into a remission that looks pretty stable, and then another 30% of patients on top of that go into a partial remission, which is a wonderful outcome. But I think what's more exciting is there are now phase 3 clinical trials for a whole range of lymphomas, for acute monocytic leukemia, and now for breast cancer. So we're really hopeful that this drug and this class of drugs more broadly will be compounds, pharmaceuticals that are effective in a range of cancers that perhaps wider than we'd ever imagined. So that's really exciting.
Wow. Take me inside that moment when you get FDA approved. Does someone ring you? Do you get an email? Do you hear a rumour going around? It must be a punch the sky moment. How did you find out?
Yeah.
And what's that like?
So as a basic research scientist, the eureka moment is when you look down the microscope and you see the discovery come into being that you've worked on for a number of years. And so this very much is not my eureka moment. There's a clinician researcher called Andrew Roberts, who's my head of translational research. He's an oncologist, haematologist at Royal Melbourne Hospital, and he got the email from two drug companies with whom we've collaborated for more than a decade, AbbVie and Genentech, now Roche, and he got the email that said the drug has been approved. And Andrew is perhaps the most understated human being on earth, and I think he pumped the air, as if you gave this beautiful analogy when we were talking, as if the grand final siren had gone off and you'd won by a point. Because there's nothing certain with pharmaceuticals until you get approval, and therefore the ability to benefit patients is everything. And I should say that I understand that now that the US regulator has been ticked off, that we are very hopeful of approvals in Australia, Canada and Europe in 2017, which is, in a sense, why we're here as an Australian Cancer Research Foundation, wanting to benefit, in the end, the Australian donors that support us.
And it will be 30 years since that amazing breakthrough observation, if that comes through next year. It's Indeed. Wonderful stuff. What a journey. Congratulations, Doug. Well done.
Thanks, Adam.
Professor Doug Hilton, ladies and gentlemen.